I have reached day 800. Actually, I've reached day 900, but I'm extremely late for my videos. Just pretend this is I'm still stuck at day 800, and yeah, I guess I'll have to make another video pretty soon. Anyway, so the topic for this time is not the ASMR video. This one is going to be for the day 900, which has already happened. And instead we're going to talk about a topic that I wanted to talk about because I figured it would be very fast, and it turns out that no, because you people decided to give me a bunch of feedback about a particular question I wanted to ask. So, the question of the day is, what are the things that you like and dislike about Reclamation Algorithm, and what would you change for Reclamation Algorithm 3 once it comes out? If it ever comes out. Okay, that's already a bad start because that's 2 questions, not 1. But regardless, due to the absolutely insane amount of feedback and reviews and answers that I got, let's get to it. The new player experience. The new player experience is terrible, but like everyone knows it. It's not really a surprise, and I am the only one who actually said something positive about it, which is that RA2 actually has a tutorial. You know, it could be worse. RA1 used to not have a tutorial, so that's quite the improvement. In case you're calling me biased, don't worry, I also have my fair share of criticisms. As a reminder, criticisms can also be perfectly positive. So let's get into it. The tutorial is not integrated to the main campaign at all. It's in its own separate area. Whatever you do in there is only going to matter there. And when I say matter, I mean to say, in fact, it does not. As long as you can defend the HQ, the rest has no restrictions on how you're supposed to complete it. Unlike the tutorials in the rest of Arknights, if you actually encounter a mechanic, they're going to show you how to do it, but they're not actually going to test whether you mastered the skill in question. In fact, you have no way to know how well you've been farming wood or gathering water or any of that stuff. A bit of failure at the tutorial here. Meaning if the tutorial had to be reworked, it will have to go in a way where it actually checks that you actually have the mastery required to complete the problem once you encounter it. Yes. As an example, if you want to see if a player actually has mastered the ability to gather wood, you need to actually give them a test whether they need to gather a certain amount of wood before they can proceed. Not just be like, hey, you just deploy your harvesters, they are going to do your job. Okay, let's move on to the next thing. Other issues with the tutorial include the fact that they don't cover a bunch of mechanics. For example, secret roles are absolutely never mentioned at any point. Even if ultimately you can learn about them at some point, in part due to stages that are way too small for anything, it will usually be much later in the game. Another point, we had quite a few expansions in Area 2. The thing is that while it expands the stats, it also presents even more features to the player, so it's going to overwhelm you with even more options. For those who are not aware, once you start, after going west for a bit, you will already be presented with the option to go to feral territories, which means you now have to learn about exotic beasts, a bunch of forever provisions, hunting net launchers, and whatnot, even though you haven't been introduced to a bunch of things just yet. On top of everything that has been mentioned thus far, we also have to take into account that the fog of war is a thing that exists. At the very least, they give us a list of the enemies that will be present in a stage, which is very nice. You don't actually have to go into the stage to know what you're going to face, which does at least give you some way of building your squad around it. That being said, the fog of war is still a thing that is going to screw over a lot of players simply because, well, you have no way to know beforehand what kind of enemies will be in which position. You might get some general clues, but unless you have a faster deploy to just face check a particular area, you can't tell. Simply put, the fog of war is particularly punishing and also extremely restrictive due to how early you have to deal with it. One possible way to fix this issue would be to change the fog into its own weather effect that gets introduced into the later regions, so that you actually give the players enough time to get accustomed to the basic game mechanics when it comes to constructs and harvesting, hunting for food, and the like. Apart from the possibility of changing it to be its own weather, another thing would be to make it available for all operators by default to have vision in the 8 adjacent tile, which is currently an upgrade in the deck tree. But frankly, this one really should be a default option because it just breaks a lot of mechanics and a bunch of operators will simply not function properly without it. Textile Soldier is definitely the most well-known example with her S3 that is only going to hit the targets that are on top of her or in the tile directly in front, even though it falls in all tiles around her. I guess to some extent one way to change it would be to still allow you to damage enemies that are not visible to some extent. When it comes to resource gathering, this is one of the biggest pain points for new players early on and very often a reason why they give up on the mode in the first place. When it comes to the gathering hubs, the one for wood for some reason requires both wood and stone to be crafted, except that stone is only unlocked in the second region, so for the most part you don't really have a way to craft too many of these. It has been made a lot easier though recently, since it is now possible to buy some of them for crude gold instead of just having to use what precious few stones you have available. It's also a particularly weird decision considering the harvesters for stone does not require any iron and the harvester for iron does not require any lightning ore, so a bit of a questionable decision. Finally, new difficulty options have been added to the game since then, since it's now possible to reduce difficulty to either peaceful or normal, in which the resources have less HP and where energy drinks just don't cost quite as much to craft. All in all, this is probably the best time for newer players to actually start RA2, but it does come at the cost of having still way too many mechanics to deal with in the first place. Overall, the current tutorial just is too limited in scope, has a tendency to present too many things at once, and completely overwhelms the player. Talking about overwhelming the player, RA2 is simply the game mode which has the most complexity in Arknights as of today, between the fact that you have to learn how to gather resources, deal with raids, learn about the fog of war, learn about territories, learn about construct, that you have access to literally all the tools in the game, just makes it so that you have way too many options, which is an easy way to just lose a bunch of people before the game mode even starts. What follows is not one of my answers, but one I received. I sum it up to the best of my abilities. In Arknights, almost all stages will be very one-dimensional. It's all going to be about eliminating all the enemies while making sure that no enemy is going to reach your blue box. And with this, I've described 99% of the stages. RA2 is not like this. RA2 is going to give you variable objectives in how you want to approach the game mode, in what you want to focus on. Do you want to prioritize building the headquarters? Should you get wood or water? Should you focus on trying to get more provisions? Should you focus specifically on forever provisions? How do you prepare for the incoming raids? Should you look for tools instead? And of course, with all that you have, your roster itself is going to put some pretty severe limitations on some of the things that you can do. If you have a particularly strong roster, you can just go straight up west, clear most of the things, and unlock the next region without issues. But if you aren't in such a position, you might have to take a bit of a break, gather some provisions before you can do this. So it makes life a lot more difficult. It's a way to temper also expectations for the different players, because let's be honest, we can't just make a guide that's going to be a one-size-fits-all for everyone. Overall, out of all the possible topics, the new player experience was definitely the one which had the most negative comments by far, and the fact that I was the only one to actually have something positive to say about it says a lot. Next up, we have the difficulty. So, for people who are not aware, you can actually change the difficulty once you are past the tutorial. This is a bad point for HG because this is absolutely not explicit. You do have this icon, but there is no label or anything that tells you that this is how you change difficulty. What they should have done is when you click on the button to start, they actually open up this menu instead, asking you to confirm the difficulty. Too many times I had a bunch of people not realizing that challenge mode was but one of 3 difficulty options. This is clearly a UI issue and should be fixed. Normal difficulty is actually perfectly fine. There are some issues with energy drinks that will take more than a fair share time of complaining in just a little bit, but it certainly makes the resource gathering aspect less annoying in the early game, and it also makes it a lot more manageable for early game accounts. Peaceful, I am in severe disagreement with this, but on the other hand, there are also been a fair few of you complaining about the raids. And I can understand why to some extent, but we'll see about it in a bit. It's just that I feel like Peaceful is kind of a band-aid, trying to solve a problem that shouldn't be there in the first place. I personally will just remove it or change it to nerf raids even further. Some aspects some of you have been complaining about that some ops do feel mandatory. I wouldn't say mandatory as much as I would say that they certainly are a big game changer when it comes to your overall experience. If you have Texas and Yato Alter, especially in the early game, this is going to allow you to snipe so many targets with so much more flexibility compared to, well, if you don't have those options. Simply put, fast deploys are particularly great, and if you are limited to only Gravel, which is a very defensive-oriented option, obviously you are going to suffer a bit more than other people early on. When it comes to the general difficulty of RA2, apart from the early game that has been already covered extensively and it's pretty punishing, the rest of the game mode does have its spike in difficulties, but those are a lot more under control and make more sense within the context of the story. The regions themselves do have an increase in difficulty overall, but you also have more tools available and a larger squad, plus some of the problems tend to be fixed. Access to more constructs, the fact that you don't have to worry about energy drinks anymore and the like. The rest of RA2 is overall pretty balanced, so this one at least has been nailed a lot better. Let's get into the raids. I didn't consider those in my initial review, but since you people mentioned it, let's go over it. From the answer I gathered, the bosses felt pretty balanced and fairly easy to counter. It's pretty nice considering that the bosses in questions actually do come up with entire raids and a large number of enemies that you also have to counter. So the fact that the bosses themselves are mechanically fairly simple is certainly helpful and is worthy of mention. However, while the bosses do deserve at least a bit of praise, the same cannot be said for all raids. A lot of those will be particularly repetitive as they attack your base, usually with no chance whatsoever of actually defeating you. Also, when it comes to raids, usually the easy plan is to just intercept them on the map, not on the headquarters. This has to do a bit with the map design of headquarters, as the walls are simply too expensive early on, so it's much easier to just intercept them anywhere else on the map. Another thing to be said about the frequency of raids. Simply put, you can't ignore them because they will go toward your headquarters, and they appear every 6 or so days on average. Meaning you really have to deal with them, and after a bit, and after you clear most of the map, they are just a mess. There is no point wasting your time doing it, the rewards are not particularly worth it, so I can see why some people would like to turn on Peaceful after some point. When it comes to the sandbox aspect, this is where RA definitely had the most positive feedback, and I can't really give you a proper overview as to how much has been said on the matter, because you guys had way too much to say, but just to go over a few things. The save system. Being able to reload and not having to restart everything from the start is a good thing. It allows you to actually experiment, try some tools, try a raid, try a boss, and if you screw up, that's okay. You can just save, try something different, and see if this is going to work this time. Like, imagine if there was a game mode that you actually had to play for hundreds and hundreds of hours, and if you were to fail, you had to start from the beginning. That would be a terrible game mode, and absolutely no one would play it. I certainly wouldn't. To keep on ranting about the sandbox aspect, a few other things that people praised a lot was the fact that it's simply endless. For one, the game mode being endless does mean that you can spend several hours building your base and see it grow as you progress through the campaign and unlock new buildings. It's nice. It gives you something that you can be proud of after going through the entire campaign and having a finalized base that you can stare at, even if it's more like a zoo than anything after some point. Other interesting aspects is that it basically gives you the idea to play with roadblocks, but an unlimited number of them, basically. There is really no other game mode with a way to build your own maze, and a lot of you have clearly enjoyed building mazes to just torture the enemies and run around in circles for hours on end. Overall, when it comes to the sandbox aspect, the game mode is definitely one of the most opened. Not only with the sheer amount of tools that you can play around with the build your own maze aspect, with the exploration and which encounters and what goals you want to set for yourself, much more than any other game mode. If anything has been successful when it comes to RA, it is that this is really the closest thing that we will ever get to a sandbox. Or at least for the time being, this is the best sandbox that we can hope for. One last point that is worth mentioning is that the game mode has very little RNG. There are some, as there is in basically everywhere. I mean, just simply bringing RNG reliant ops can bring some, but overall the way you go through the different regions has fairly little RNG to it. Ultimately, you are the main guideline who decides where you want to go and when. Now to hop on to the negatives. The game mode itself is long, very long. It's not necessarily a bad thing, in fact it can be endless, but for people who don't necessarily have that much time to dedicate, this can be a big block. Though in some aspect this is also a bit of the player's fault. This game mode is going to require you to be slightly more dedicated to it, and comes back to the initial point that the rest of Arknights kind of set expectations for its stages, and RA tends to go away from set expectation pretty far. So I'm not entirely willing to blame the game mode on this. Some of the complaints regarding the more sandboxy and exploration part has also to do with the 2 acts per day, or the stamina system as a whole. So we have a few things to cover here. Energy drinks and stamina. Basically, the first one, energy drinks, is something that's a bit questionable because it's a mechanic that is going to really be relevant basically only for the early game, as it limits what you can do and how many operators you can bring. It feels very artificial as a limitation. In fact, some people prefer the stamina system from Reclamation Algorithm 1. In Area 1, it was possible for your operators to be used once a day on average, but because they had a limit of 3 units of stamina, if you need it in the same day, you would be able to actually use them twice for a given day, even if there is still this limit of regenerating stamina. So in situations that actually demand it, for example, where you have to deal with multiple raids at once, then it was just possible to use more energy drinks to actually clear everything without trouble. Probably the main reason why this system wasn't kept was that it did require you to give an energy drink to each and every operator that you wanted to bring to a raid. Now, in a way, this problem can already be fixed by simply increasing the supply of energy drinks, though it also came with a lot of micromanagement since you had to constantly give said energy drinks to the operators in question. It would have been a lot simpler if all that happened was that energy drinks would only be consumed every time an operator is actually sent to a raid, so you don't have to manually assign said energy drinks to the ops. Overall, I would say that neither Area 1 nor Area 2 has particularly succeeded in the management of energy drinks. This mechanic, frankly, could be removed and we could simply come back to a very basic system relying on deployment slots in Area 3, and it would just be a better experience overall. Not only will it be less restrictive for the early game, which is currently the most difficult, but also we won't have to bother with it in the later stages, but in Area 2 it's already completely irrelevant. As such, I think the better solution would simply be to have a deployment limit of 6 early on, and as you progress through the story and unlock an higher headquarters level, you simply get to deploy some constructs in your HQ that increase the deployment limit. In many ways, this is going to solve the problems because that means you can't just easily bring 12 operators to every single operation. Well, you technically can, but simply put, a lot of them are just going to be sitting in reserve doing nothing instead. Indirectly, it would serve the players better by asking them the questions, are you really sure you want to bring all those operators when just 6 can be enough to do the job? Maybe 7 in a pinch. Other issues that you guys had some problem with? The provision system. The provision system itself is not too bad, but there are a few things that definitely could be improved. The first one, it's not particularly convenient when it comes to the UI because there is no way, if you want to craft a particular food many times, you will have to do it manually every single time, which is annoying. There definitely could be a button that allows you to make some batch cooking so that you can just give a jerky to all your operators in just a few clicks. When it comes to weather, I had one comment that stated that the weather effects and the seasons are a bit too harsh. I kinda agree with this. At the very least, there should be something else to make up for the fact that, well, you are losing 40% of your max HP and 1 block, and on top of this, you have a thunder that you have 2 lightnings that can strike the same spot and basically nuke most operators in a single hit. It is pretty rough, and if at the very least there could be some way to make up for the fact that, well, your enemies are standing in acid rain, so they do have some debuffs, technically speaking, but those are so minor that they might as well not exist. When there is rain ongoing, your Krabby Pumpies will pump more water, but it's not doing much in terms of combat. If during an acid rain the enemies had reduced defense to make up for the fact that you are also getting debuffed, it would certainly make a lot more sense. Also, some of the effects could definitely be reduced. Minus 40% max HP is very rough, and I know that there are technically some tools to combat this, but Omni Umbrella is not something that people can afford early on. So overall, I can definitely see some rework being done there. Some other piece of feedback I got regarding provisions were that, generally speaking, they are not particularly interesting, or they are prohibitively expensive for what you want to achieve. Someone mentioned how most of the food has basically no interesting effect apart from increased stats most of the time, and I kinda agree. There are some that are definitely game-changing to some extent. Between giving camouflage, the extra SP is definitely nice, but ultimately it's, while it unlocks a bunch of strategies, it's effectively just a reduction in some particular stats. There is one food that I think is a step in the right direction, which are the candies that are given to you by the Grand Priest, because while they give 1 SP every 6 seconds, they also force your operator to cast their skills automatically. Sadly, you can't craft those even after unlocking them, but definitely going forward that would be a nice way to go about the next provisions. In the Dungeon Meshi collab that we had, you could give some provisions to your operators, and one of those would, for example, double their attack speed or halve the attack speed based on the cycle. And it would be nice to have more food that are based on this with both negatives and positives. You could very well have food that drastically reduces the attack of your operator, but also massively increases their defense, so that you actually have to make some sacrifices. For particularly spicy example, you could have a provision that grants the operator the ability to deal burn damage for a significant portion of the damage deal. Except there would be a small sacrifice, like having the 8 adjacent operators that would take constant burn damage just by being in proximity. That definitely could make for some spicy combos. Of course, there are a lot of possible ideas, and ultimately that's up to AG to find these out. But definitely, we need more funny provisions to change the gameplay quite a bit. Next on our list is a topic that no one else has mentioned, surprisingly, but it is worth speaking about it. I think one of the problems is that AAA is simply a game mode that is pretty intense when it comes to overall performance. It can basically turn your phone into a Molotov cocktail, so definitely some work needs to be done when it comes to performance. Luckily, there are some good news. There is a PC client that has been announced, and from what I heard, there was a performance-focused patch that was delivered on CN, to be seen if it actually changes anything when we actually get it. If we haven't gotten it already, but this is one. Another one would be for the design of some particular enemies. In particular, Must-Beast. The reason these enemies are deserving of mentions when it comes to performance specifically is that they have a buff that checks the proximity of other Must-Beasts in the area, and their presence has a tendency to drop your frames to single digits very, very easily. Luckily, you get your frames back as soon as they die, but having those kinds of enemy in mass is, combined with the rest of array, enough to just make things particularly bad. So I'd rather just not see that kind of enemy anymore, or at the very least drastically reduce their number. One point that is going to be of interest also along with the next topic that we're going to discuss, which will be map design, is the main base also is a particularly large map. Apart from Mineshaft Crawl and Domain of Velo, which are the two largest maps apart from this, it is a particularly laggy map, especially if you start stacking a lot of constructs, making things barely playable if you have some pretty serious raids coming in, especially if we have Must-Beast on top of them. Several redesigns of the maps could be done in order to reduce the number of walls required and indirectly help performance this way. But I'll go into it with slightly more details in just a moment. For general stage and map design, there have been some interesting opinions out there. One of those being that some people do enjoy seeing the enemies from the various events we already had in the past, basically everywhere, which I agree. It's nice to have a pretty large diversity of enemies, even if those are some of the reused enemies from other events. Ultimately, I can understand that AG just doesn't want to make 200 different enemies just for one game mode. So I can understand why AG went for this, as a way to just make sure that we are not just facing the same thing over and over again. Other aspect would include the general look of the map. Some of the maps are particularly dark. In particular, the mine maps are pretty dark, and yeah, it is pretty difficult to see. If your screen is a bit dark and you have a bit of light, it can be difficult to spot things. I did have the issue as well, so a bit of better lighting would be nice. Other complaints relate a lot to the secret walls. Either them being a bit too well hidden in the larger maps, or them being in spots that are a bit too difficult to reach. Regarding them being a bit too hidden, I didn't really have much of a problem. However, when it comes to them being difficult to reach, I do agree that they are not intuitive. We are back to the secret walls not being explained, and probably won't be getting an explanation anytime soon. But basically the idea is that they can be destroyed using splash damage. So things like Orn, Fiammetta, Wizardale, even Spectre's Altar's Dole, or Old Pianist S3 all are considered splash damage, and as such they can destroy a secret wall even if it's not being directly targeted. All this is not particularly intuitive and definitely lends some weight to the fact that some walls certainly feels like they are designed around the idea that you should be using splash, or at the very least that you should be using maybe some kind of harvesters or some very particular setups to actually break through these, which is inconvenient and usually wastes a lot of time, especially in those particularly large maps like a Mineshaft Crawl. When it comes to the remaining points, some of the early maps have a pretty severe lack of natural range tiles. It's very difficult for an early game player to make a bunch of battlements because most of the resources will already be pretty strained due to them having to craft planting box groups, for example, or having to upgrade the headquarters. This particular map, for example, which has only 2 natural range tiles, doesn't really make a lot of sense to exist so early in the game, especially considering even a bunch of late game maps have a lot of range tiles available. It's a bit too early for the game to drop this kind of maps in the player's face. So to be honest, these probably could use a few extra range tiles that doesn't require you to bring your own battlements. Finally, when it comes to outpost designs, it's no secret that one of them is infinitely better than the other two. These other two just are extremely open and cost a lot of barriers to actually block all the possible enemies' paths. You can definitely optimize to some extent, but frankly, they are giving us a pretty hard time right from the start. Considering most of the time the better option is simply to intercept the raids outside, especially early on, they really could have made some maps that are a bit more friendly when it comes to just building some defenses, especially since you have to do it for 3 different nodes no less, not even including the HQ. Now 2 elements are more specific to the user interface and the general user experience. There are 2 big points. The first one comes to the game clarity when it comes to particular objectives. Some of the nodes on the map, for example, are blocked, but they aren't particularly explicit when it comes to telling you what exactly you need to do to pass them. In fact, if you go to the Arknights official Discord, one of the most common questions is, how do I get past the yellow marker on the map? It turns out that the answer is to just keep on going with the main quest. But it kind of begs the question as to why we have a quest marker on a node if already it doesn't tell you what to do if you want to actually pass it. At the very least, it could tell you, well, it looks like we'll have to get back here at some later point. Another one comes down to the fortress nodes specifically, because the fortress nodes actually require you to deal with the fortress building, which you have to destroy to actually win the map. It's important to note because several fortresses feature bosses, so it wouldn't be surprising for a newer player to come to this map, see that there is a boss, and figure that their goal is to eliminate the boss, since that's what you have to do for most raids anyway. But it turns out that the answer is no. It's not currently made super explicit by the game, so it would be a small UI difference where the game would simply have to precise that the end goal is indeed to destroy the fortress and not the boss. The second big point is more trouble with the general management of provisions and recipes. Simply put, recipes are very annoying to scroll through because sometimes you cook a specific food for an operator, and if that one differs from the one you previously fed to that operator, it's not going to appear at the top. You have to craft the food, and then scroll down the list, and then finally feed that food to the operator. Generally speaking, the provision system definitely requires some more rework to be a lot more manageable. On to the main story. Out of all the elements that there are in RA, this one is one of the most positive ones. The storytelling, as is done with cutscenes, is a lot more digestible. It's a lot shorter and people get a lot more interested in it because there is a lot more immersion and you get to see the chibi play around and do some animations instead of just standing there menacingly in the usual visual novel style that is core to our nice story. In fact, it's pretty telling because one of the negative points is that there isn't enough story. At this point, we are going against the flow of the usual Ian Country allegations, which is starting to be pretty spooky, so definitely a big plus for the main story. There is one complaint, which is that once you have reached the end of Act 3, it's basically over. After the Act 3 and after the Lord Emirs, lore-wise, have basically given up on fighting Rhodes Island, there isn't much else to do. Basically, the rest is just about maxing out your base and doing the maximum difficulty for both Strange and Feral territories. But apart from this, you don't have anything else to be done. Apart from my RA CC, but for the most part, a lot of people will simply go to day 6 to get the medal or day 18 to get all the rewards and stop there. So it's not like there isn't much else to be done. One suggestion that someone made was to introduce a non-quest super boss that would be particularly difficult, but also would be completely optional. In some way, it would be introducing a post-game. Even if to some extent we do have some kind of super bosses, but it's locked behind strange territories and a very low chance to fight some of the boss you've already fought, but with the added difficulty from the extra pressures that you get from strange territories. Sadly, this is behind a massive RNG wall and the odds of you fighting a specific boss are extremely low. So definitely for possible late game options, it would have been very nice to be able to fight the same bosses that we fought during the story without having to go through Reclamation Algorithm CC or through a big RNG barrier. Now, if I were to ask you this one simple question, what topic could possibly draw as much anger as a new player experience? What would you guess? If you guessed logistics and expeditions, congratulations, you have found the right one. Literally 80% of the people who have played RA have complained about how the fact that you have to constantly resend the same operators times and times again to the same expeditions to go gather resources, usually for the deserted town, but also in some of the encounters, is absolutely a slog. Basically, you have to constantly send 6 or 3 operators, based on whether they're experienced or not, to an expedition, and you have to do it every few days. And you have to do it for all 4 deserted towns. And you also have to do it for all the encounter expeditions for which you actually want to send ops as well. It's way too many clicks that you have to constantly do. As much as I'd like to complain about logistics and the fact that it just locks your operators while just giving passive buffs, which is not very interesting because it just means that you can't play with the operators in question anymore, at least it has a benefit that you don't have to constantly reassign people to keep with logistics buff. Expeditions really need a way for you to tell the game that you just want to keep sending with same operators over and over again. That's if they actually keep the system, because realistically I would much prefer if we had another system in place, but we'll go over these into the area 3 suggestion. So stick with me a little longer there. Other than this, it's just going to be a better filter and sorting option for the list of operators. Pretty please. The current one is just way too lackluster. Do you like slugs? Well, I certainly do, but what about slug races? Generally speaking, people think that they are pretty fun and creative, and they are very fine to do, but it's mostly going to be for the first time around. Or I guess the first few times, since there is a bit of RNG, and people have pretty rightfully complained that some of the maps will simply require you to restart them, solely due to the fact that you keep getting some magnets and they just don't want to give you a vacuum at any point. It's not to say that RNG ruins it, but you certainly have very little control over what you can do. The only thing that you have is when to activate the object that you get, but since the object in question is randomized, sometimes you are not even interested in activating at any point. Sometimes you waste the object intentionally so that you can just get a better item. Slug races, a pretty cool game mode, but ultimately a bit lacking in options. The next topic is an interesting one. RACC, or Critical Contentions. Much to the disappointment of some people, I don't have that many comments about the game mode, at least not in terms of general criticism. The pool of bosses that you have to fight is pretty limited. If you are going up to day 18 to get all the rewards, you will only have to fight one or two bosses. If you go to day 30 or higher, you will already have unlocked all the possible debuffs. Going further than this, the only difference really is that the stats of the bosses will keep on increasing infinitely. The part with the bosses having much simpler mechanics and being fairly straightforward to counter is actually kind of negative here, because suddenly they are a lot less interesting, with the exception of basically two of them, namely the Windbringer and Alrafik. Alrafik because it requires such a very specific setup that you have to actually study and think about, and the Windbringer because this particular raid is dangerous in combination with what the Windbringer himself can do. It turns out that summoning a bunch of explosive slugs is going to one-shot everything that you have within range is not that easy of a challenge to deal with. But apart from these two, the rest of the bosses are fairly uninteresting. For the most part, it's just going to be baiting attacks or just binding them until they die with nothing else. So a bigger boss pool will definitely be nice, or having a bigger boss complexity overall when it comes to dealing with game mode with infinite scaling. And I guess to some extent some additional incentive, like even if it's just 1000 LMD per day that you cleared, it's not much, but it would still be a reason for people to play the mode ultimately. One big complaint about RACC is that if you actually have a run ongoing, you can't go back to regular array. If I want to go back to the main campaign, I actually have to cancel my existing run, and I don't want to do this. I figured that the developers never imagined that some people would be silly enough to actually try and push hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of days, but because of this, I'm stuck in RACC until I die or until I quit. So please add an option to actually quit the existing run, or at least play the regular array campaign while also being able to play CC at the same time. And now we have finally arrived at the player suggestions for Reclamation Algorithm 3. There is a lot to be said, and I'll be reading some of the suggestions more directly since it does give a better idea of what the original intent was, instead of me adding my interpretation layer. Don't reuse all maps, since at first RA2 felt like RA1. I definitely agree with this. Frankly, if an old map has to be reused to some extent, it should still be changed to showcase the fact that time has passed, that things are different. But even then, RA3 really should be in another region, so I don't see any justification for it. So yeah, new maps, please. Add ability to pick up a support operator on a save day. Absolutely. One of the biggest pain points also for newer players is that, contrary to the rest of Arknights, they have no possibility whatsoever of having a support unit. I'm not sure how to introduce the support operator, because ultimately this is going to also depend on what kind of changes is made to like the stamina system, for example. But at the very least, it should be an option. There should be a possibility for players to do so, as to make the game mode a lot more new player friendly. Give access to important tools like walls, miners and rice fields immediately. Ultimately, you can get all these almost right from the start since it's headquarters level 2. But definitely, it's not going to change much to make those available right at level 1, and also the harvesters should definitely be available either for resource that's not too difficult to get, unlike stone, for example, for the sowing harvesters, or yeah, just having alternatives, like it is currently possible to buy the sowing harvesters for crude gold, for example. Or simply you don't use any of those and you can just rely on exoskeletons if you really want to pick up a bunch of resources on the ground. This was a cool introduction, frankly. Automate dispatches because it's a pain to send all 4 of them. This has already been mentioned, but it does bear repeating. Sending operators on expeditions just is currently taking way too many clicks, so we need some way to automate this. Food, energy system. Since at first you starve and can bring 7+ operators because it consumes too much energy, but later the system is skipped completely. That isn't really a suggestion-ish? It's not really clear what you want to change, but overall I still would agree that the energy system needs to be reworked. Both the energy drink plus stamina aspect of being able to use an operator multiple times a day, maybe, just like it was possible in Array 1. Regardless, yeah, some reworks needs to be done, because this system is just to screw you over early and does nothing for the late game, so change it. Suggestion for improvement. Make the map more straightforward, less hostile toward everyone, maybe take the fog of war out entirely, or at least stop designing the map in a way that fuck inexperienced players in the ass so they die and have to reset for it. This one is pretty straightforward and comes back to the initial criticism of the fog of war. Simply put, there introduces too many mechanics at the same time, and the fog of war would be a lot more manageable if it was considered a weather effect that only gets introduced in the later regions, or if there were some reworks to it, like for example making it possible to see in the 8 adjacent tiles. So absolutely yes. Make the gathering up easier to get. Self-explanatory. I don't know if it did fix this yet, but as I've played right now, when the game mode starts, placing one of the gathering up wrong could mean reset. Miserable time. They did make it easier to get, so props to Hypergriff for doing so. It's still not ideal, and ultimately I still think they should remove the stone coast from the summoning harvesters, but yeah, that's already a step in the right direction. Hopefully they will learn from their mistake and do better in Array 3. More forgiving stamina system. Please let me bring Nerl with me 2 times a day. Yes, this is mentioned again, but this is really the crux of the issue here. The stamina system is really completely pointless in the later stages of the game, and the early game really doesn't need it. More ingredients and more food. A bit personal, but I would like to make operator able to eat 5 dishes and make the provision effect more simpler, and let people mix and match what they want as a buff for the operator. It will be way more creative and funny. I already mentioned that some people complained about the provision systems being a bit too simple. This is one of those. Ultimately, I don't necessarily think that you should be able to eat 5 dishes, or I guess the 5 ingredients could have some very widely different effects as they currently do. I guess instead of having just main recipes, each ingredient is bringing its own different effect. That could definitely be a thing instead. All in all, provisions definitely need to be a lot spicier. Pet Simulator. Very personal. I want to feed Mumu clone. My question to you would be, why would you want to simply feed the Mumu clone when you could simply feed Mumu herself? I mean, we are technically doing it, but sure. A consistent way to control at least weaken the weather. Pretty much full beast brand, weather wisher and counter as a permanent node. There are definitely ways to counter the weather, but these are usually locked behind tools that are way too costly for people who are just getting started with the mode to possibly grab. The Omni Umbrella is one of them, but this is definitely a late game option that requires some exotic materials, and the remote shield generators just cost a lot of resources overall, even if it's going to protect you by giving you a shield regularly. None of these are practical options until you reach the late game. Make it semi-based, to have the excuse of having certain maps to become randomized after a certain amount of days, which makes it the only way of refreshing resources, but a construct can make it stop. It's actually a really cool idea on how to randomize nodes, so big props. That's actually a pretty original way of doing it, and I don't mind going to semi. I know we already did it with IS4, but ultimately it sort of feels like there is more creative freedom to be found there. Is there going to be enough excuse to get here and do things for Array 3? I don't know, but it's up to HG. They'll probably make it work if they have to. A reminder on how you get water, because I feel like deploying it and doing nothing is kinda boring compared to having to attack stones and such. Well, an easy fix could be to have operators attacking the Krabby Pumpy and counting it as defensive recovery, a bit like the anti-net launchers. Of course, this should probably only be used to accelerate the production, but not so much to be necessary for it to function at all. After all, the entire point is to make it possible to automate the process of collecting water in the first place. But if you have any idea on how to implement this, you can put it in the comments of the video. I don't really have any other idea myself. These are the type of weather to inflict cold and remind the fucking player to get water until it arrives. More weather effects that fit the theme? Sure thing, as long as they are not as completely bullshit as some of the ones we currently have. I don't really like seeing the operators explode for no apparent reason when the enemies can, for some reason, walk under the same exact weather and still be perfectly fine. Make it so optional Mal super bosses could raid the boss if not interrupted after some time, to encourage them to actually fucking do them since edit raids are shit anyways. So when I read this, I was wondering what it referred to. I guess the No Man's Land would definitely be the closest thing to it because you do have a bunch of bosses in the No Man's Land. That being said, I'm not entirely sure I agree with this, simply because, well, that's kind of the point, that those are optional super bosses. If they raid you after a certain amount of time where you don't do anything, then they're not particularly optional anymore, are they? Still, someone did mention super bosses at some point as a possible late game option, so at least some variant of it could be done without having to rely on a game mode like AAAAAAA CC. This is an excuse because I love Sammy's theming. I wonder if there is anything in your suggestions that could possibly hint at this. Add a way to play multiple games at the same time without the need to wipe out save. This one is pretty straightforward, and also we know it's already possible, since that's basically what's happening between AAAAAA CC and the regular campaign. The only issue is that obviously you can't jump from AAAAAA CC to the regular campaign once you've started it, but since it's saved, we know that at least the state itself is saved. Not to mention that there are at least 3 save slots when you actually want to reload from in-game. So it should be possible, technically. The ugly reworks. Add rework vision. Fugawar is very hostile towards newer players that don't know what they're doing, and I wouldn't mind seeing the vision tech tree passives in the current iteration being standard from the get-go. Upgrades could instead be additional vision tiles on top of what's already granted, extending vision range to just past attack range, perhaps. But I'm just spitballing at this point. It's just a thing that could easily put off people relying on their operators to perform and getting denied. Maybe buff to vision towers to a detection, I don't know. Fugawar already got a fair amount of mention before, but the buff to vision towers is actually a pretty good idea. The current one basically see no use outside of tier 3, which reveals the entire map. Tier 1 and tier 2 just are too bad to justify using, but definitely they could add pretty strong buffs to them. If they revealed in the range of Deadeye snipers in all 4 directions, then definitely a lot more people would be using them in the first place, so that's definitely something that HG should be introducing. Operator availability. I like a fatigue system based on how much damage and retreats they take. Actually kinda like XCOM Enemy Unknown within Long War mode. This would be a difficulty spike for taking brutal losses on raids, but to counterbalance it I'd like 2 things. 1 is support or temporary operators like elite operators to be made available for use. 2 is to re-enable provisions, or feeding operators food in general, to make them available to use again faster. As much as I'm a bit unsure about having a system which punishes you for the damage and retreats that you have to actually take, for example, what about the faster deploys operators? Or what about just newer players that just have a tendency to, well, struggle a bit in the early raids? That will be extra punishing, and I'm not too sure I'm fond of it. Maybe as an additional system for higher difficulty settings, but probably not something by default. That said, the two suggestions, adding a support unit and even possibly temporary ops, I'm not sure I know how they should be introduced, as well as just having provisions being used to enable more than one act per day, are two suggestions that I can definitely get behind, so props. Provisions. They are alright, I guess. People do settle in on their favorites, but I think they really underturned early game provisions to the point where it's not even worth crafting, and I think it's a shame. Even late game recipes usually fall away to just select few, and the cost benefits of it all need review. My favorite example is probably that minion poetic jail squads that are too expensive to have fun with as a non-permanent food item. Sure, it is really busted, but compounding with slugging through your eyes to make it happen, it's no wonder few have experienced the joys of SB spam like this, even if they can reset if they don't like it. Provisions have already been mentioned as a way of saying that, yeah, they really need to be made more interesting than what they currently are. A lot of them are just stat buffs, so we need something more fancy than what we currently have. Some of them are interesting, but we need more of it. Also, the duration of the provisions feels surprisingly low. In fact, unless you had a bunch of salt, which is an ingredient which is pretty difficult to farm, the provision questions are not going to last more than just like 10 or 15 days for the higher tiers usually, maybe up to 20 if you're lucky. But when you take into account the fact that you want to feed all 12 of your operators, it's no wonder that people just rely on forever provision and call it a day. Finally, it comes down to my own suggestions. I have two. The first one is going to be when it comes to the main page redesign. And lo and behold, this is a paint picture of what I came up with. So at the top you actually have the headquarters that you are supposed to defend. The white rectangles everywhere are high ground tiles. The green parts will be swamps. The effect of swamps would be to slow down the enemies that go through it. The thing is, you can't construct anything. The brownish parts are holes, so you can just throw enemies in them. The blue parts are where you are supposed to be placing some Krabby Pampies. That's right, you now have an option to add Krabby Pampies in your HQ. Or at least that's what I'd be looking for. The general idea behind redesigning the base is to reduce the number of constructs, for one. Two is to actually make it easier to defend your HQ in the early game, so that you need fewer walls to actually defend it, as opposed to the one where you need to surround it with things, and also to change the way the player is going to develop. Because here you have a pretty easy to defend area that you can block with just a few walls. But if you want to actually expand outside of it, you'll have to take some risks. So building in this area, for example, is going to be a lot more difficult because you now have to defend from attacks coming from this direction, and this direction as well. All in all, it's here to make the early game a lot easier and cheaper to defend, while making the late game more interesting. The environment is also not just a flat plane, so it does make mazes a bit more difficult, but there are several aspects and several things I wanted to try with this. Another one is that the fact that enemies are coming from different directions also changes the way you should be approaching the raids. If you just decide to defend your headquarters, this is going to be a very basic fight. Enemies coming from the bottom, as you can see, you have a lot of range tiles available. And this is going to make it easy if you don't have that many resources and you want to intercept them right away. The pits here, obviously you have no obligation to use them, but if you do have some shifters, it's going to be pretty nice. One thing I wanted to make sure of is that this particular corridor would need to have a width of 2 tiles at most. The reason being that we don't want to just funnel all the raids up here and then near pit to just throw them down the pit, because otherwise you just trivialize everything. The idea behind is also to encourage players to try and defend different lanes and use the advantages and disadvantages provided by the lanes to the best of their abilities. So This particular area does not have that much room for deployment, but it does allow you to throw enemies into pits. The swamps, you have very little room to actually add constructions, but the swamps themselves are already going to massively slow down the enemies. The water itself, if you decide to build a barrier and force the enemy through water, they are going to be slowed down and take some damage, while you can keep them there. The one at the bottom is fairly straightforward. You just have a lot of natural range tiles available, so if you want to use things like camouflage food, it's going to be possible to bag some more combos while being safe. Ultimately, this is but one possible suggestion for how a base could be redesigned, and this should not be taken at face value. It's just a way to say, yeah, make the main base more interesting. It turns out that adding restrictions usually lead to more interesting base designs rather than just having a flat plane. Because, let's be honest, nowadays if you want to defend your base, you're going to do the exact same thing, where you just surround the HQ with a few walls, you make a few wings to force the enemies to come to one side, and then you just burn everything without any thought into it. Here, at least, if you want to push all the enemies into the walls, you'll have to build a long maze that will force all the enemies down and there, and you'll have to somehow push them here and then down the hole. As far as I'm concerned, if you manage to do this, you probably deserve to win this way. On the other hand, maybe you just want to force all the enemies to go through some water and drown them. That's also an option that's given to players. Or maybe you're just classic and you just want to abuse the natural range tiles that are available to you. That's also a thing. All in all, it gives more options when it comes to defending the base rather than just having the classic, just have a bunch of battlements. It will be a lot more interesting. It will also mean less constructs on the map, which will help significantly when it comes to performance, because ultimately every time the game has to do some checks when it comes to whether there is an AoE, the game has to calculate the distance between the impact of an AoE with basically all the structures that could be hit in the game. So that is it for the redesign. The other suggestion was regarding RA CC, or at least a replacement for RA CC. I was thinking, well, a lot of people really like IS for how fresh it is. We could have like a roguelike survival wave-based defense of your HQ where you start with nothing or close to nothing, and as you defeat waves that actually do get stronger, you get to pick between a set of different constructs, so you get to build your base and try to survive with this. Something a bit like a Stronghold protocol, but instead of having a fixed map, you get some walls as a drops and other tools that you have to pick, and you have to try and survive for as long as possible. The roguelike and wave-based aspect will also mean that you are not required to grind for hours upon hours before you can actually start to run. You can start basically as soon as you unlock the game mode. The roguelike aspect will also add quite a bit of flexibility to the developers if they want to add some difficulty modifiers, for example, if they want to make an extreme version of the game mode without too much problem. And with this, we are at the end of the video. I probably missed some of the feedback that have been sent to me or forgot something. So if I have, don't hesitate to just add it in the comments. Talking of which, if you yourself have some suggestions or some feedback, some opinions about Array, doesn't have to be Array CC specifically, don't hesitate to talk about it. Like, if I can forward some of those thoughts and feedbacks that some of you people have to HG, I would not hesitate to do so. If I missed anything, it's not because I hate you, it's just because I'm forgetful, and also because you people have been absolutely amazing and have been sending me way too much things. Well, that's a good thing in and of itself. With this, that means I'm good to already start working on the 900 days video since I've already reached it, so stay tuned. I'm also going to do the weird YouTuber thing where I ask you to like and subscribe because this kind of video takes absolutely hours to edit, and that's not mentioning all the feedback that had to be retrieved in the first place. Anyway, see you on day 900. Bye bye, Doctor.
us all for. Be the champion of your stories as you rally here before me. You show me what we're sailing toward. No es un lugar muy, muy lejos. It's what we carry through anywhere we sail aboard. As we sail, she's still within us. She's a star within us, all that's burning bright, burning bright. There are channels to explore, miles of map to rediscover. I no longer stop to wonder what it is we're sailing toward. Alas tu voz, isa las velas. Say I proudly board the seas from which we hail. As we sail, she's still within us. She's a star within us, all that's burning bright within us, all that's burning. Star within us, all that's burning bright, burning bright.
when I'm in too deep. Ooh, ooh, and I'm out at sea. You would rescue me. You say we'll get through this together.